Good evening, fellow gays. Tonight, I want to take you to a specific place and time, to a grimy, mafia-owned bar in New York City's Greenwich Village at 1:20 a.m. on a hot, sticky Saturday morning in June 1969. The air is thick with the smell of spilled beer, cheap perfume and something else. A simmering frustration that's about to boil over. It's the moment when a police raid, a common humiliation for gay people of the era, suddenly goes wrong. Or depending on your perspective, spectacularly right. It's the moment a drag queen, maybe Marsha P. Johnson, maybe someone whose name is lost to history, decided she'd had enough and threw a shot glass, or was it a brick, that was heard around the world. This moment, this explosion of righteous anger at the Stonewall Inn, reveals something extraordinary about courage, community, and the breaking point of a people pushed too far. As you settle in tonight, we're going to uncover not just what happened, but why it matters to every LGBTQ person today, and why these stories of our survival have been hidden or softened for so long. Before we begin this journey, let us know in the comments where in the world you are listening tonight. Our community spans the globe, and please take a moment to like this video if these stories matter to you and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these histories to light. Now dim the lights and prepare to discover why the Stonewall Uprising changed everything. Chapter 1. The heart of the story. It's the summer of '69. Man is about to walk on the moon, Woodstock is a few weeks away, and the world feels like it's on the brink of something. But for the gay men, lesbians, and trans people of New York City, the world is mostly about avoiding trouble, and trouble more often than not wears a badge. The Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street wasn't a glamorous place. It was dark, it was divey, and it was one of the few places where men could dance with other men. It had no running water behind the bar. The glasses were just dunked in a tub of murky water and reused. The place was run by the mob, who saw a lucrative opportunity in providing a space for a community that society deemed criminal, and then blackmailing the wealthier patrons on the side. It was, in short, a deeply compromised sanctuary, but it was theirs. As you're settling in tonight, imagine the scene. The jukebox is playing, maybe The Fifth Dimension, maybe some Motown. The dance floor is crowded, bodies moving in the dim light. There's a sense of freedom here that doesn't exist on the street outside, but it's a fragile freedom, always waiting for the flash of headlights, the heavy knock on the door. That knock came, as it often did, just after 1 a.m. The bright, ugly house lights flickered on, the music died, and 8 police officers swept in for a routine raid. This was a familiar ritual. Patrons would be lined up, their IDs checked. Men caught in clothes deemed to be for the opposite gender were arrested. The staff would be arrested. The cash register would be emptied. Usually, the crowd would disperse quietly, melting back into the shadows, humiliated but resigned. But not this night. Something in the humid summer air was different. The police decided to be rougher than usual. They got aggressive with a lesbian who was being shoved into a police wagon. Eyewitness accounts differ on the exact details. Some say she was hit on the head with a baton. But what everyone agrees on is what she did next. She looked at the growing crowd of onlookers on the street and yelled, "Why don't you guys do something?" It was a spark on a mountain of gasoline. Suddenly, the resignation that had defined a generation of gay people evaporated. The crowd didn't disperse. It grew. Pennies and loose change began to fly through the air, then bottles, then cobblestones pried from the street. The police, stunned by this unprecedented defiance, found themselves outnumbered. They retreated, barricading themselves inside the very bar they had just raided. The hunted had become the hunters. The crowd, now numbering in the hundreds, began to rock the police wagon. They tried to set the bar on fire with the cops inside. A parking meter was uprooted and used as a battering ram against the door. What was happening here wasn't a political protest. Not yet. It was something more primal. It was the collective roar of a people who had been told their love was a crime, their identity was a sickness, and their existence was shameful. It was the sound of a closet door being kicked off its hinges, not by one person, but by an entire community, all at once. The story of what happened next, over the coming days, reveals how a spontaneous riot transformed into a revolution, but the road to that night was paved with decades of quiet, desperate courage that history has nearly forgotten. Chapter 2. The Catalyst. To understand the explosion at Stonewall, you first have to understand the suffocating silence that preceded it. The 1950s and 60s were not a kind time to be gay in America. This was the era of the Lavender Scare, a moral panic that ran parallel to the anti-communist Red Scare. While McCarthy was hunting for communists in the government, the same mechanisms were used to purge homosexuals. Being gay was seen not just as a moral failing, but as a national security risk. The belief was that a gay person was susceptible to blackmail and could therefore not be trusted with state secrets. Thousands of men and women lost their jobs, their reputations, and their futures simply for who they were. While your eyes grow heavy, picture a world without the internet, without support groups, without a single positive depiction of a gay person on television. A world where the American Psychiatric Association officially classified homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance, a mental illness. To find each other, you had to navigate a secret world of codes. The colour of a handkerchief, the turn of a phrase, a lingering glance in a public park. Every connection was fraught with risk. You could be arrested, beaten, fired, or disowned by your family. The bars, like the Stonewall, were often the only physical places to find community, and they were constantly under threat. But in this oppressive climate, the first tentative seeds of a movement were being sown. These weren't fire-breathing revolutionaries. They were quiet, bespectacled men and women who called themselves homophiles, a deliberately soft academic-sounding term meant to be as unthreatening as possible. In 1950, a man named Harry Hay founded the Mattachine Society in Los Angeles. They were a secret society with cell structures modelled after the Communist Party for their own protection. Their goal wasn't liberation, it was something far more modest: to be left alone, to be understood as a respectable minority. They wore suits and ties to their protests, a far cry from the drag queens of Stonewall. They wanted to prove that gay people could be just as buttoned up and patriotic as anyone else. In 1955, a group of lesbian couples in San Francisco formed the Daughters of Billy Tiss. It started as a secret social club, an alternative to the often dangerous bar scene. Under the leadership of women like Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin, it grew into a national organisation providing support and education for lesbians. They published a magazine called The Ladder, the first of its kind, which was mailed to subscribers in plain brown envelopes. For many women living in isolation across the country, seeing that envelope in their mailbox was a lifeline. It was proof they weren't alone. These early groups were incredibly brave. They were operating in an environment of total hostility, chipping away at the mountain of prejudice with the smallest of hammers. They organised letter-writing campaigns. They held small, orderly protests called annual reminders outside Independence Hall in Philadelphia. But their approach was always one of polite assimilation. They were asking for a seat at the table. The generation at Stonewall, however, was about to decide they were done asking. They were going to build their own damn table. The tension between these two approaches, polite assimilation versus radical liberation, was the fault line running right under Christopher Street, and it was about to rip the world wide open. Chapter 3. The Community Response. The first night of the Stonewall Uprising ended as the sun came up, with the streets still littered with glass and an astonished sense of What just happened? But it wasn't over. That feeling, that intoxicating mix of fear and power, had spread through the city's gay community like wildfire. Word of mouth was the only social media they had, and it was working overtime. People who had spent their entire lives in hiding, who had always run from a fight, heard the news and felt something shift inside them. The second night, even more people showed up on Christopher Street, and the third night, and for nearly a week after. This wasn't just a single riot, it was a sustained occupation. The police came back in force, but so did the protesters. The tone shifted from a spontaneous outburst to a conscious act of defiance. The crowds were now filled with a diverse coalition of people. The street kids and drag queens who had started it, but also older men in suits from the Mattachine Society, lesbians from the Daughters of Bilitis, and college students who saw the fight for gay rights as part of the larger civil rights movement rights and anti-war movements of the time. As you drift and listen, imagine the sounds of those nights. Not just anger, but joy. For the first time, people were chanting pro-gay slogans out in the open. They formed kick lines in the street, facing down rows of riot police, singing satirical songs. They held hands, they kissed, they openly displayed the affection that had been criminalised for centuries. It was a political act, but it was also a massive defiant street party. They were taking the shame that had been weaponised against them and turning it into pride. In the immediate aftermath, the energy was chaotic but electric. Activist meetings were held, leaflets were printed. A new, more radical generation of activists was born in the fires of the uprising. They looked at the careful, respectable approach of the Mattachine Society and said, "Thank you for your service, but that's not going to work anymore." The old guard believed in quiet diplomacy. The new guard believed in kicking down the door. From this energy, a new organisation emerged, the Gay Liberation Front, or GLF. Their name was a deliberate echo of the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. They saw their struggle as one of total liberation, not just assimilation. They didn't want to just be tolerated by straight society. They wanted to dismantle the very definitions of gender and sexuality that had oppressed them. Their foundational statement declared, "We're a revolutionary group of men and women formed with the realization that complete sexual liberation for all people cannot come about unless existing social institutions are abolished." It was a radical, thrilling, and frankly terrifying idea for many. To commemorate the 1-year anniversary of the uprising, the GLF and other groups planned something unprecedented. Not a quiet, orderly picket line, but a march, a celebration. They called it Christopher Street Liberation Day. On June 28th, 1970, a few thousand people gathered, nervous but determined, to march from Greenwich Village up to Central Park. They weren't sure if anyone would show up. They weren't sure if they'd be attacked. But as they marched, their numbers swelled. People came out of bars and apartments to join them. By the time they reached the park, there were thousands upon thousands. It was the first Pride March. It was the community realising, for the very first time, just how powerful it had become. But a surprising turning point was coming, one that would take place not on the streets, but in the halls of science itself. Chapter 4. The Turning Point, Revelation. For all the righteous energy unleashed by Stonewall, the gay community still faced a massive, insidious obstacle. It wasn't just the law, or the church, or the police. It was science, or at least what passed for it. Since the 19th century, the medical establishment had framed homosexuality not as a natural variation of human desire, but as a pathology, a disease, a mental disorder to be cured. This medical diagnosis was the rock upon which all other forms of discrimination were built. If you were officially sick, how could you be a teacher? If your mind was disordered, how could you serve in the government? It was the ultimate trump card for prejudice. giving it the cold, hard veneer of scientific fact. This is where one of the most brilliant and audacious acts of protest in LGBTQ+ history took place. And it didn't involve a single brick or bottle. The target was the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, and their Bible of Mental Health, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. In its pages, homosexuality was listed right alongside schizophrenia and other severe mental illnesses. As long as it was there, true liberation was impossible. So, in 1970, a year after Stonewall, activists from the Gay Liberation Front decided to take the fight directly to the doctors. They stormed the APA's annual convention in San Francisco. They grabbed microphones, disrupted panels, and demanded to be heard. One activist, Larry Littlejohn, commandeered a lecture on transsexual surgery and shouted, "You are the people who have been oppressing us. You have been engaged in a war of extermination against us." The psychiatrists were, to put it mildly, stunned. The protests continued the next year at the APA's convention in Washington, D.C., but this time, a gay psychiatrist named Frank Kameny, one of the founders of the Mattachine Society, had orchestrated a secret weapon. He had arranged for a panel discussion on homosexuality, but with a twist. He was going to have an actual gay psychiatrist speak. The problem was, no gay psychiatrist was willing to risk their career by coming out publicly. So they found one who agreed to speak, but on one condition: he would be in disguise. A packed auditorium of the nation's leading psychiatrists. A figure walks onto the stage wearing a distorted Richard Nixon mask, a glittering tuxedo several sizes too big, and speaking through a microphone that completely disguised his voice. He introduced himself only as Dr. H. Anonymous. He then delivered a powerful personal speech about the pain and fear of living a double life within his own profession, a profession that labelled him as mentally ill. He spoke of the soul murder that his colleagues were committing against their gay patients. The stunt was theatrical, it was absurd, and it was utterly brilliant. It forced the psychiatrist to confront the human being behind the diagnosis. The pressure campaign worked. The APA began to hold internal debates. They reviewed the scientific data, or lack thereof, that supported the classification of homosexuality as a sickness. And on December 15th, 1973, in a move that sent shockwaves through the medical and legal worlds, the APA Board of Trustees voted to remove homosexuality from the DSM. It was a stunning victory. It was the moment our love, our identity, stopped being an illness and started being just us. This revelation that the science behind the prejudice was hollow was the intellectual earthquake that cleared the path for everything that followed. It meant the fight was no longer about curing a disease. It was about demanding civil rights. But just as the movement was celebrating this incredible win, a new, far deadlier cloud was gathering on the horizon. Chapter 5. The Ripple Effects. The 1970s, post-Stonewall and post-DSM, were a decade of incredible progress and explosion in gay culture. In cities across America, gay neighbourhoods blossomed. Bars, bookstores, and community centres became the vibrant heart of a newly visible people. Political power began to grow. In 1977, Harvey Milk was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, becoming one of the first openly gay elected officials in the United States. His message was one of hope and visibility. "You must come out," he urged. "Come out to your parents, your relatives." He knew that the more people knew a gay person, the harder it would be to hate. It felt like a golden age, but it was tragically short-lived. In the summer of 1981, the CDC published a small, cryptic report about a rare form of pneumonia found in 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles. It was the first official mention of what would come to be known as AIDS. At first it was a whisper, a gay cancer. Then it became a terrifying, unstoppable plague. Young, vibrant men were suddenly wasting away, covered in lesions, dying horrific deaths. And the world was silent. As you're listening tonight, try to imagine the sheer terror of that time. There was no test, there was no treatment, there was no known cause, and because it was primarily affecting gay men, the Reagan administration and much of mainstream society simply looked away. It was viewed not as a public health crisis, but as a moral punishment. President Reagan wouldn't even say the word AIDS publicly until 1985, by which point thousands had already died. It was a silence that equaled death, so the community did what it had always done. It saved itself. In the absence of government action, gay men and lesbians created a network of care and support from scratch. Organisations like the Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHC, in New York were founded. They started hotlines, provided legal aid, organised buddy programs to cook and clean for the sick, and held the hands of the dying when their own families had abandoned them. They became experts on a disease that the experts had ignored. But care wasn't enough. The silence had to be broken. This need gave rise to one of the most ferocious and effective activist groups in American history, ACTUP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Founded in 1987, ACTUP's philosophy was direct action. They were loud, they were disruptive, and they were brilliant. They chained themselves to the doors of pharmaceutical companies, demanding they speed up drug trials. They staged a massive die-in on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange to protest the exorbitant price of the only available treatment, AZT. They infiltrated scientific conferences and presented their own, often superior research. Their slogan, "Silence equals death," emblazoned on black t-shirts, became an iconic symbol of the era. They weren't just protesting a disease, they were protesting a system that had deemed their lives disposable. The ripple effects of this period are immense. The AIDS crisis was a crucible of unimaginable loss, but it also forged the LGBTQ+ community into a political force unlike any other. They learned how to lobby politicians, how to master the media, and how to fight the medical establishment and win. They had survived a plague not just from a virus but from hatred and indifference. This strength, born of grief and rage, would be the engine for the next great battle, the fight for a seat at the very head of the table. Chapter 6. The Living Memory. The turn of the millennium saw the LGBTQ+ community standing on new ground, hardened and honed by the trials of the past. The lessons learned in the trenches of the AIDS crisis, how to build a community care network from nothing, how to stare down government indifference, how to become experts and advocates when no one else would, had created a generation of savvy, organised and unapologetic leaders. The next great frontier was clear: the fight for legal recognition of our relationships, our families, the battle for marriage equality. At first, the idea seemed a distant dream, a political third rail that many mainstream politicians wouldn't touch. Early victories, like Vermont's introduction of civil unions in 2000, felt like huge steps, even if they fell short of full equality. They were a kind of separate but equal for gay relationships, a compromise that signalled progress, but also reinforced difference. The fight was a long, slow, state-by-state slog, waged in courtrooms, at ballot boxes, and in countless conversations over dinner tables. For every hard-won victory, like Massachusetts becoming the first state to legalise same-sex marriage in 2004, there were painful, gutting defeats. None was more jarring than Proposition 8 in California in 2008, which cruelly stripped away the right to marry after thousands of couples had already joyfully, finally tied the knot. Each of these battles brought intensely personal stories to the forefront. The fight was never about an abstract legal concept. It was about the tangible daily realities of people's lives. It was about couples who had built a life together for 40 or 50 years, who were denied the right to visit each other in the hospital because they weren't family. It was about parents who couldn't be legal guardians to the children they were raising. It was about the simple, profound dignity of having your love, your commitment, your family recognised as equal in the eyes of the law. Let's focus on one of the stories that cracked the foundation of inequality, the story of a woman named Edie Windsor. Edie and her partner, Thea Spire, met in the early 1960s. They were a team, a partnership that spanned more than 4 decades. They were engaged in 1967, long before such a thing had any legal meaning. In 2007, with Thea's health failing from a progressive form of multiple sclerosis, they flew to Canada to finally get married. When Thea passed away in 2009, Edie was left with not only crippling grief, but a crippling bill from the federal government for estate taxes, a tax that a surviving spouse in a heterosexual marriage would never have had to pay. The government, through the Defence of Marriage Act, DOMA, refused to recognise her as Thea's wife. So Edie, then in her 80s, decided to sue. Her case, United States versus Windsor, argued that DOMA was unconstitutional. In 2013, the Supreme Court agreed, striking down the part of the law that denied federal recognition to same-sex marriages. It was a monumental victory that set the stage for the final act. That final act was carried on the shoulders of people like Jim Obergefell. His story is one of profound love against a ticking clock. His partner of over 20 years, John Arthur, was in the final stages of ALS, a brutal degenerative disease. John's dying wish was simple, to die as a married man, and for their home state of Ohio to recognise that marriage on his death certificate. Because they couldn't travel conventionally, they had to raise over $13,000 to charter a special medical jet. On the tarmac of the Baltimore airport, with John lying on a gurney and a relative officiating from her seat on the plane, they were married. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking ceremony. A few months later, John died, and as they feared, the state of Ohio refused to list Jim as the surviving spouse. So Jim sued. His case, Obergefell versus Hodges, was eventually consolidated with others from across the country and went all the way to the Supreme Court. The legal arguments were complex, touching on due process and equal protection, but the question at its heart was simple. Does the Constitution guarantee the right for 2 people of the same sex to marry? On June 26, 2015, almost 46 years to the day after the first brick was thrown at Stonewall, the answer came, yes. In a 5-4 decision, marriage equality became the law of the land. The wave of joy and relief that swept across the country was overwhelming. For anyone who was out at the time, that day is seared into memory. The internet exploded. Social media feeds turned into a cascade of rainbows. People who had been fighting this battle for decades wept in the streets. The White House itself was lit up in brilliant rainbow colours, a symbol of acceptance from the highest office in the land that would have been utterly unimaginable to the patrons of the Stonewall Inn. It was a moment of profound validation, the culmination of a fight that stretched back through the decades, back through the AIDS crisis, past Harvey Milk, all the way back to that grimy, beautiful, defiant bar in Greenwich Village. But history never truly ends. For every action, there is a reaction. The victory of marriage equality, as glorious as it was, also crystallised the opposition. The focus of the anti-LGBTQ+ movement, having lost the marriage battle, pivoted with alarming speed and ferocity to a new target, the transgender community. The T in our acronym, long overlooked by many even within the movement, was suddenly thrust onto the front lines of the culture war. The arguments were sickeningly familiar. repurposed from the fight against gay rights. They were a threat to children, a danger in bathrooms, a violation of traditional values. While your mind begins to dream, picture this new battlefield. It's not fought in bars or on the streets as much as it is in state legislatures, in school board meetings, and online. The fight is for the right of trans kids to receive gender-affirming healthcare, the right for trans people to play sports, the right for a young person to be called by their chosen name in a classroom. It's a fight, at its core, for the very right to exist visibly and safely. This is the living memory of our movement in action today. The spirit of defiance that animated the Stonewall rioters now lives in the trans youth and their parents who travel to their state capitals to testify against discriminatory laws. The community care networks built during the AIDS crisis are echoed in the mutual aid funds that help trans people access life-saving healthcare. The thread is unbroken. The struggle for liberation has always been about expanding the circle of who is considered worthy of dignity and respect. The gay men and lesbians who fought for their rights in the 70s, 80s and 90s, whether they all knew it or not, were building a foundation. Now, that foundation is being used to fight for our trans and non-binary family. The living memory of our history is not just one of struggle, but of this incredible, unbreakable thread of progress. The drag queens who fought back against the police in 1969 made it possible for the activists of ACTUP to demand life-saving drugs. The activists of ACTUP made it possible for lawyers like Edie Windsors to stand before the Supreme Court and demand equality. And that victory for marriage equality now provides legal and moral precedents for the fights we are waging today. Each generation builds on the victories of the last and is tasked with protecting those who are most vulnerable. The story isn't over, and perhaps it never will be. The fight for trans rights, for the safety of our youth, for racial justice within our own community, and for equality in the many countries around the globe where it is still a crime to be gay, continues. But what the journey from Stonewall to the Supreme Court shows us is that change is not only possible, it is inevitable when a community refuses to be invisible. It proves that a handful of people pushed too far in a dingy bar on a hot summer night really can start a revolution that continues to change the world, one brave, unbreakable spirit at a time. As our journey through the unbreakable spirit of our movement concludes tonight, we're reminded that LGBTQ+ history is not just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here, honouring those who fought for us, and recognising that we're part of an ongoing story of courage and love. The people who were there that night at the Stonewall Inn showed us that our breaking point can also be our beginning. The quiet courage of the early homophile groups, the fiery brilliance of ACTUP, and the loving devotion of plaintiffs like Jim Obergefell remind us that there is no one right way to fight for freedom, and that love is always worth fighting for. Until our next journey into queer history together, this is the Sleeping Gay, encouraging you to remember that you are part of a beautiful, resilient legacy that stretches back through all of human history. Sweet dreams, beautiful gays, and may your rest be filled with pride in the remarkable tapestry of LGBTQ+ history that connects us all. As we continue our journey into sleep, let's explore together a new bonus story or thoughts read by our guest narrator.
Good evening. Tonight I want to take you on a different kind of journey. We won't be recounting history with dates and events, but with footsteps and echoes. I want to take you to the sacred spaces where our history was made, to walk the streets where our ghosts still whisper. I want to take you to Christopher Street in New York, just as the first light of dawn touches the brickwork of the Stonewall Inn. The air is still and cool. The only sounds are a distant sanitation truck and the tired sigh of the city. But if you listen closely, you can hear something else. The the lingering energy of a revolution, the echo of a shot glass shattering, and the roar of a community finding its voice for the very first time. This journey, this virtual sound walk, reveals something extraordinary about how our story is written into the very pavement beneath our feet. As you settle in tonight, we're going to uncover not just the places where our history happened, but the feeling of being there, connecting our present to the courage of the past. Before we begin this journey, let us know in the comments what you consider to be a sacred LGBTQ+ space in your own town or city. Our community has hallowed ground everywhere. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these histories to light. Now dim the lights and prepare to walk through the living memory of our sacred spaces. Chapter 1. Christopher Street at Dawn. Our walk begins here, in the heart of Greenwich Village, New York City. The time is just before sunrise. The moon is a pale sliver in the sky, and the streetlights cast long, lonely shadows. As you're settling in tonight, imagine you are standing across the street from 53 Christopher Street. The air has that unique pre-dawn stillness of a great city, a moment of quiet breath before the chaos of the day begins. You can smell the faint, sweet scent of yesterday's rain on the hot summer pavement, and the slightly sour smell of beer-soaked wood wafting from the bar's doorway. This is the Stonewall Inn. It's smaller than you might have pictured, just a 2-story brick building, unassuming, almost plain. But this is the epicenter. This is our ground zero. Let your eyes adjust to the dim light. The rainbow flags that hang there now are still, their colors muted in the gloaming. The street is empty, save for a few stray newspapers skittering in a phantom breeze. There are no crowds, no police, no news cameras. It is a place returned to itself. But it's not truly empty, is it? As you listen, the silence begins to fill with ghosts. You can almost hear the phantom bass line of a Motown song through the brick walls. You can almost feel the vibration of dancing feet from a Saturday night 50 years ago. This is where they came to feel free, in this dark, mob-run dive that served watered-down drinks in dirty glasses. It wasn't a palace, but it was a sanctuary. Now let your mind drift back to the morning of June 28, 1969. The scene here would have been one of beautiful chaos. The air thick with adrenaline and defiance, the street littered with shattered glass that glittered like diamonds in the first rays of the sun. There would be overturned trash cans, a stray high heel, maybe a smear of blood on the sidewalk. And standing right where you are would be the kids who refused to go home, the street queens, the runaways, the young men who had nothing left to lose, and so found they had everything to fight for. People like Marsha P. Johnson, perhaps adjusting a flower in her hair, looking at the boarded-up windows of the bar, not with fear, but with a sense of weary, righteous ownership. This quiet dawn is the aftermath. It is the moment after the explosion, the deep breath that follows the roar. The world hadn't changed yet, not really. The newspapers would call it a freak incident, a homosexual riot. But for the people standing on this pavement, breathing in this morning air, everything had changed. The shame was gone, burned away in the heat of the night. It was replaced by a question, a dangerous and thrilling question that hung in the air like the scent of ozone after a storm. What if we didn't run away this time? What if we stayed and fought? The story of what grew from that question would span a continent and a generation, but it all began here on this quiet street corner in the sacred, exhausted silence of a new day. Chapter 2. The Secret Village. From the stillness of Stonewall, our sound walk now expands. Let's turn the corner and wander through the winding streets of Greenwich Village. But we are stepping further back in time into the world that made Stonewall necessary. We are in the 1950s and early 1960s. The sun is higher now, casting a soft golden light on the brownstones and lush trees of Washington Square Park. The sounds are different here. The roar of the city is more muted, the gentle rumble of older cars, the distant chime of a church bell, the murmur of conversation from a sidewalk cafe. As your eyes grow heavy, picture this world. This is the era of the homophile movement, a time of immense caution and coded language. Being gay is a secret, a heavy coat you can never take off. So our walk is one of quiet observation. We are looking for the signs. A glance held a second too long between two men on a park bench, a woman in a tailored suit walking with a confident stride that defies the era's expectations of femininity, heading toward one of the few hidden lesbian bars on a side street. The community existed, but it was a ghost network, a web of whispers and secret knowledge. Let's pause here. In the heart of Washington Square Park, you can hear the splash of the fountain and the happy chatter of children. To the casual observer, it is a scene of perfect normalcy. But for gay men of this era, this park was a marketplace of stolen glances, a place to see and be seen without ever speaking a word. A man might sit on a particular bench with a particular book, signaling his interest. It was a silent, intricate dance of risk and hope. One wrong move, one misread signal could lead to public humiliation, a beating or arrest. Every connection was a small miracle of courage. Now let's walk a few blocks over, past the old, grand buildings of New York University. We stop outside an anonymous-looking apartment building. Imagine a man coming home from his respectable job in an office downtown. Let's call him Dr. H. Anonymous, the brave psychiatrist who would later speak at the APA conference in a mask. He straightens his tie, unlocks his door, and for the first time all day, he can exhale. He can take off the mask of conformity. Maybe he puts on a record, something classical. Here, in the privacy of these four walls, he is himself. But even here, there is fear. He keeps his books on homosexual studies hidden. He speaks in code on the telephone. This was the unbearable weight the pre-Stonewall generation carried. They weren't fighting with bricks, they were fighting with their own sanity, trying to build a life and a sense of self in a world that told them they were sick and criminal. The quiet dignity of a group like the Mattachine Society holding an orderly suit-and-tie protest seems almost quaint now, but in this context, it was an act of radical bravery. They were chipping away at a mountain of prejudice with the smallest of hammers. They were creating the language and the networks that the post-Stonewall generation would inherit and ignite. Our walk through these quiet, beautiful streets reminds us that a revolution doesn't always begin with a shout. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, a secret meeting, a shared look that says simply, "You are not alone." From this city of secrets, our walk must now take a great leap to a place where the secrets were about to come bursting out into the brilliant California sun. Chapter 3. The Castro's Rainbow Heartbeat. Now let's allow the sounds of New York to fade, replaced by a new city, a new energy. We are 3,000 miles away and a decade forward in time. We are standing on the corner of Castro and Market Streets in San Francisco in the mid-1970s. The air here is different. It's clean and bright, with a hint of salt from the bay. The sun is warm on your skin. And the sounds are alive with an almost electric sense of joy and possibility. As you drift and listen, hear the iconic clang and rumble of the F Market streetcar as it crests the hill. Hear the buzz of conversation and laughter spilling out of open storefronts. Hear the music, not muffled by brick walls, but blasting from record stores, a soundtrack of disco and funk that is unapologetically, joyously gay. This is not a hidden community. This is a neighborhood, a capital, a beacon. For the first time, our walk is not one of stealth and shadows, but one of pride and visibility. Let your eyes take in the scene. The Victorian houses, with their ornate painted lady facades, are draped in rainbow flags, a new symbol of pride that has just begun to take hold. The storefronts are a testament to a community building its own world. There's a gay bookstore, a gay bakery, a gay dentist, and there, on the corner, is a small, unassuming camera shop, Castro Camera. Let's walk towards it. Through the window, you can see a man with a warm, infectious grin, talking animatedly with a customer. This is Harvey Milk. Is Harvey. He wasn't just a shop owner, he was the self-proclaimed mayor of Castro Street. His camera shop was the unofficial community center. People came here not just to get their film developed, but to get help with a landlord, to report a police officer, to find a job, or just to talk. Harvey understood something fundamental. Political power came from the ground up, from organizing your own people block by block, business by business. Let's imagine stepping inside. The air smells of photographic chemicals, a sharp but not unpleasant scent. Harvey greets you with that famous smile. He's probably standing on his soapbox, both literally and figuratively. He kept a wooden box in the shop to stand on to make announcements to the crowds that would gather outside. Listen to his voice. Not a polished politician's voice, but one full of passion and a slight New York accent. He's talking about hope. The hope that a gay person can be a teacher, a doctor, a supervisor. "You gotta give 'em hope," he would say. This was the sound of the Castro in its golden age, hope. It was the sound of a generation of young men and women who had flocked here from all over the country, escaping the suffocating small towns that had rejected them. Here, on these streets, they were not just accepted, they were the majority. They could walk down the street holding their partner's hand without fear. It was a dream made real, a promise of a new and better world. The energy was intoxicating, a beautiful, vibrant heartbeat of a community that had finally found its home. But even in this paradise, a shadow was beginning to gather, a quiet storm that would soon attempt to wash this all away. Chapter 4. The Empty Streets of a Plague. We remain on Castro Street, but the light is changing. The vibrant, sun-drenched afternoon of the 1970s fades into a perpetual, somber twilight. We have moved forward in time to the mid to late 1980s. The hope and euphoria have been replaced by a heavy, suffocating quiet. The plague has come. While your body grows heavier and more relaxed, let your mind walk these streets once more. The air is the same, still crisp with the scent of the Pacific, but now it feels different, thinner. The first thing you notice is the sound, or rather, the lack of it. The joyful disco music is gone. The laughter from the bars is muted. The constant, energetic buzz of the street has been replaced by a hushed, mournful silence. You can hear your own footsteps on the pavement in a way you couldn't before. It is the sound of a community holding its breath. Look at the storefronts again. Castro Camera is still there, but Harvey is gone, assassinated in 1978. Now many other storefronts are empty, with "for lease" signs gathering dust in the windows. These were businesses started with such hope a decade ago, now closed because their owners are sick or dying or have already passed. There are new additions to the streetscape too. There are pharmacies with long lines of anxious-looking young men. There are clinics and community centers with names like Shanti Project, their windows filled with flyers offering support groups and legal aid. Let's pause on a corner. A gust of wind blows down the street, and with it comes not the sound of music, but the sound of a lone, racking cough from an open apartment window above. It's a sound that chills you to the bone. Every day, the newspapers are filled with obituaries, young, beautiful men who were alive and vibrant just months before. Everyone knows someone who is sick. Everyone is attending memorials. The streets are emptier because so many of the people who filled them with life are gone. But in this overwhelming silence, listen for a new sound. It's not a sound of joy, but of rage. It is the sound of a chant. Silence! Death! It's the sound of a group of activists, members of ACT UP, marching down the center of the street. Their faces are a mixture of grief and fury. They are not just mourning, they are fighting. They are protesting the silence of their government, the indifference of the world. They are staging die-ins on the streetcar tracks, stopping traffic, forcing the world to look at the bodies and the death that it has tried so hard to ignore. This sacred space, once a symbol of liberation and joy, has become a battlefield. It is a place of memory, a living memorial. Every corner holds a ghost. That bar was where you had your first date with someone who is gone. That bookstore was owned by a friend who is gone. That apartment building was where you held someone's hand as they took their last breath. Our sound walk through the Castro of the 1980s is one of profound loss, but it is also one of unimaginable strength. It is the sound of a community abandoned by the world that refused to abandon each other. It's the sound of love and rage forged in the crucible of a plague that would give the movement the strength it needed for the final push into the very halls of power. Chapter 5. The Halls of Power. Let the fog of San Francisco dissipate, and let us find ourselves in a new city. A city of marble and monuments. We are in Washington, D.C. The air here is heavy, humid, and thick with the weight of history and power. Our walk is no longer through a neighborhood, but along the grand, imposing avenues that connect the great institutions of American government. The sounds here are formal, structured, the distant wail of a motorcade siren, the flap of flags against their poles, the low hum of a city run on bureaucracy. Our first stop is a place you wouldn't find in any tourist guide of queer history, yet it is profoundly significant. We are standing across the street from the former headquarters of the American Psychiatric Association. It's an impressive, stately building. In the early 1970s, this institution held the power to define who we were, and their definition was simple: sick, mentally ill. As you listen, imagine the scene here in 1971. It is not quiet. A group of activists, including Frank Kameny and Barbara Gittings, have stormed their annual convention. Try to hear the echoes, the shouts from the back of the auditorium, the gasps of stunned psychiatrists in suits, the powerful, amplified voice of an activist who has grabbed the microphone, declaring, "We are not sick." This building, a symbol of the cold, clinical prejudice that had ruined so many lives, became a site of our resistance. It was here that the intellectual foundation of our oppression began to crumble, not with a riot, but with data, with logic, and with the sheer, irrefutable presence of sane, intelligent gay people demanding to be seen as such. Now let's walk a few blocks down the grand expanse of the National Mall. We arrive before the United States Supreme Court. The building is immense, almost temple-like, with its towering marble columns and the words "Equal Justice Under Law" carved above the entrance. For most of our history, those words did not apply to us. This building was the source of devastating decisions like in 1986's Bowers versus Hardwick, which upheld the right of states to criminalize gay sex. Standing here then would have felt hopeless, like standing at the foot of an unmovable mountain. But now, let the timeline shift. We are here on a bright, sunny morning in June 2015. The atmosphere is electric. A massive crowd is gathered on the steps and the plaza in front. They are holding rainbow flags, homemade signs, and pictures of their loved ones. There is a nervous, joyful energy in the air. People are checking their phones, listening to news reports. They are waiting. And then a cheer begins. It starts small, then grows into a deafening, euphoric roar that echoes off the marble facade. The decision in Obergefell vs. Hodges has come down. Marriage equality is the law of the land. Imagine you are in that crowd. The person next to you is weeping with joy. An elderly couple who have been together for 50 years are holding each other, their faces etched with a kind of profound, exhausted relief. The sound is one of pure catharsis. It is the sound of a long, long battle finally won. It is the sound of justice. This sacred space, once a symbol of our exclusion, has, for this moment, become a place of our greatest victory. The walk from the dark, defiant streets of the village to these bright, sunlit marble steps was long and brutal, but it shows that the halls of power can, eventually, be made to listen to the voices from the street. Chapter 6. Our Spaces Today. Our journey through time and space is now coming to an end. Let the sounds of Washington, D.C., the cheers and the traffic, gently fade away. In their place, I want you to listen to the sounds of your own space right now, the gentle hum of the refrigerator in your kitchen, the distant sound of a car passing on your street, the quiet rhythm of your own breathing as you lie here, safe and comfortable. Our sound walk is coming home, from the Stonewall Inn at dawn to the hopeful heartbeat of the Castro, through the haunted quiet of the Plague, and to the marble steps of the Supreme Court. We have walked through the memories embedded in the very ground beneath our feet. These places are not just locations on a map, they are containers of our story. They are the sacred spaces where our identity was forged in struggle and celebration. But the most important part of this journey is understanding that these sacred spaces are not just in New York or San Francisco. They are everywhere. As you rest here tonight, think about your own town or city. Is there a particular bar where you first felt safe to be yourself? A community center where you found support and friendship? Is there a park bench where you had your first real conversation with someone like you? That exhilarating moment of recognition? Is there a street where you marched in your first Pride parade, feeling that incredible surge of belonging? These are our sacred spaces. They may not have historical plaques or monuments. They are sanctified by our own experiences, by our own courage. The gay bar in a small town in Ohio, the one with the blacked-out windows, is a direct descendant of the Stonewall Inn. The LGBTQ+ student center at a community college in Florida is the heir to the hope of Harvey Milk's camera shop. The small group of friends who gather to support a trans teen are echoing the caregivers of the AIDS crisis. History is not something that happened back then to other people. It is a living thing that flows through us and consecrates the spaces we inhabit today. The walk we took tonight was a pilgrimage. It was a reminder that the rights and the visibility we often take for granted were bought at a profound cost, on specific streets by specific people. Standing on Christopher Street at dawn, you feel the defiance of the rioters. Standing on Castro Street, you feel the hope of Harvey and the grief of a generation. Standing before the Supreme Court, you feel the cumulative power of every single person who ever came out, who ever marched, who ever loved openly in a world that told them not to, that we are the living memory of these spaces. When we live our lives openly with dignity and kindness, we honor the ghosts and the heroes of this journey. We carry the sanctity of those places with us. The struggle is not over, but the ground beneath our feet is firmer now because it rests on the foundation that they built. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, know that you are part of this map, this sacred geography of our people. Your own space, your own home, is another safe harbor, another point of light in the vast, beautiful constellation of our shared history. As our sound walk through our sacred spaces concludes tonight, we're reminded that LGBTQ+ history is not just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here, honoring those who fought for us, and recognizing that we are part of an ongoing story of courage and love. The people who were there that night at Stonewall showed us that even the most ordinary of places can become hallowed ground when we stand up for our dignity. The communities who lived through the hope of the Castro and the horror of the plague showed us that our greatest strength is our ability to create family and sanctuary for one another. The echoes of their footsteps remind us that every street we walk on openly is a path they help to clear. Now for our second bonus nighttime story. This is called Voices from the Archives, a sleep story told through secret gay letters and diaries. Tonight, we are going to do something a little different. Our journey into the past will not be guided by my voice alone. Instead, we are going to open the archives, unlock the old wooden chests, and gently unfold the brittle yellowed pages of history to let the people who lived it speak for themselves. I want to take you to a quiet, dusty room filled with the scent of old paper and leather. Here, in these boxes, are the secret hearts of our people, their letters, their diaries, their poems, their pleas. These are the words they wrote when no one was looking, the truths they could only commit to paper, often in the dead of night. This journey, a tapestry of their voices, reveals something extraordinary about the unbroken thread of love and resilience that connects us all. As you settle in tonight, we are going to listen to the whispers of our history, uncovering not just what happened, but what it felt like to live and love in a world that often refused to see them. Before we begin this journey, let us know in the comments a figure from LGBTQ+ history whose voice you wish you could have heard. Our pantheon of saints and ancestors is vast. And please take a moment to like this video if these stories matter to you, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these histories to light. Now dim the lights and prepare to listen to the voices from our archives. Tonight, there will be no chapters, no interruptions, only a gentle flow of words, a river of voices that carries us from one era to the next. Let my voice be the current, and their words be the water. Relax, let go, and just listen. Our journey begins in a time of profound, suffocating silence. The early 20th century. A time before movements, before organizations, before there was even a shared language for who they were. To love someone of your own sex was a crime, a sickness, a secret to be carried to the grave. The only connections were fleeting, dangerous, and lived entirely in the shadows. The letters from this time are often coded, their language veiled, but the longing burns through the paper. Here is a voice, a composite of the kind of letter a young man might have written to another after a brief, stolen meeting around 1912. My dearest James, I find I must commit to paper what my cowardice forbade me to say aloud when last we met. The air in the park was thick with the scent of coming rain, and yet I felt only the warmth of your presence beside me on that bench. The way you spoke of books, of art, of your hopes for a life less ordinary. It was as if you were speaking the language of my own soul, a language I thought only I understood. I have replayed our conversation 1,000 times in my mind. Did I imagine the lingering touch of your hand when you passed me the book of verse? Did I invent the meaning I saw in your eyes in that final, fleeting glance before we parted? This city is a lonely place, James, a wilderness of strangers, each of us playing a part, wearing a mask that suffocates. To meet someone who sees, even for a moment, the man behind the mask is a thing of terrible, beautiful rarity. I must confess, I live in constant fear of a misspoken word, a misinterpreted gesture, fear of my own nature, this thing the world calls an affliction, but which, in your company, felt simply like me. I do not know what this is between us, nor what it can be. The world has no name for it, other than ugly ones I refuse to write. But I know that for a few brief moments on a park bench, I was not lonely. I hope this letter finds you well. I hope you will not think ill of my forwardness. And I hope with all my heart you will be in the park again next Sunday. Yours, in quiet hope, Thomas. The women of this era lived under a different but no less heavy cloak of invisibility. Their attachments were often dismissed as romantic friendships, intense but ultimately harmless phases before the inevitability of marriage, but their diaries and letters tell a different story. They tell of lives lived in partnership, of commitments as deep and true as any other. Listen to this entry in the voice of a woman watching her partner sleep, written around 1928. The fire has burned down to embers, casting a soft, flickering glow on Helen's face as she sleeps in the armchair opposite me. The city outside is quiet now, wrapped in a blanket of fresh snow. It is in these moments, these stolen hours of peace, that I feel the full weight of my love for her. The world sees us as companions, two spinsters sharing a home for convenience. My family calls her my dear friend. They do not see the way her hand finds mine in the dark of a picture house. They do not hear the way we speak of our future, a future built for two, a life woven together thread by thread. Sometimes a terrible fear grips me. What if one of us were to fall ill? The world would rush in, her family or mine, and I would be relegated to the status of a concerned acquaintance. I would have no right to sit by her bed, no right to make decisions, no right to my own grief. Our entire world, so solid and real within these four walls, is a phantom to everyone else. She stirs in her sleep, a small sigh escaping her lips. I know her every breath, her every dream. I love her more than life itself. And yet, in the eyes of the world, we do not exist. Tonight, that feels like a tragedy. But then I look at her, so peaceful in the firelight, and I know that a love like ours, seen or unseen, is the only truth that matters. As the century moved forward, the world was plunged into the chaos of war. For many young gay men and women, military service was both a terrifying risk and an unprecedented opportunity. It was the first time they were removed from their small towns, their watchful families, and thrust into a world composed entirely of their own gender. It was here that many realized for the very first time they were not alone. The letters they sent home were censored, but the letters they sent to each other, passed hand to hand, tell a story of discovery and camaraderie in the face of death. This is the voice of a soldier, a young man from a farm in Kansas, writing to a fellow soldier he served with, dated 1944. Dear Robert, I hope this letter finds you in one piece. This place is a hell you wouldn't believe, but then again, you'd believe it better than anyone. I got your last letter. Read it so many times the paper is soft as cloth. It's funny, you know. Back home, I thought I was the only man in the world who felt the way I do. A freak of nature. I spent my whole life trying to pray it away, trying to be the son my father wanted. Then I met you and the guys in our unit. It was the first time in my life I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. Remember that night in the barracks when we all sat around talking, not about girls, but about our lives, our real lives? It was the first time I ever said the words out loud, the first time I ever felt normal. Being here, with death a possibility at any second, it makes a man honest. I'm not scared of dying for my country, but I am scared of dying without ever having really lived, without ever having been myself. You and the others, you gave me a glimpse of what that life could be. If I make it out of this mess, I'm not going back to Kansas, not to the old life. I'm going to find a city, a place where there are others like us, a place where I can breathe. Thank you for that, Robert. You saved me in more ways than you'll ever know. Stay safe, my friend. Jax. After the war, a new kind of silence descended. The Cold War, the Lavender Scare. The brief sense of community found in the military was shattered by a new wave of persecution. This was the era of purges, of blackmail, of lives ruined by anonymous accusations. But it was in this climate of intense fear that the first sparks of an organized movement were kindled. Cautious, secret societies began to form. They called themselves homophiles, a word chosen for its clinical, unthreatening sound. They published small magazines, mailed in plain brown envelopes, filled with essays, poems, and letters from readers who were finding a lifeline in their pages. Here is a letter to the editor of The Ladder, the magazine of the Daughters of Bilitis, the first lesbian organization in the US. The year is 1957. Dear editor, I am a woman of 35, a schoolteacher in a small town in the Midwest. I have been a subscriber to The Ladder for 6 months, and I must tell you, the arrival of your magazine is the most anticipated event of my month. When I see that plain brown envelope in my mailbox, my heart leaps. It feels like a letter from a family I have never met. For my entire life, I believed I was utterly alone. The books I could find on the subject describe me as sick, as deviant, as an unfortunate case. I have lived with a shame so deep it felt like a part of my own skin. To read the stories and poems in your magazine, to see my own feelings and experiences reflected in the words of others, has been a revelation. For the first time, I am daring to think that I am not sick, but simply different. That my love for another woman is not a curse, but a part of who I am. I still live in fear. I could lose my job, my home, my reputation, if anyone in this town were to discover my nature. But your magazine has given me a small, steady flame of courage in the darkness. It has given me the strength to look in the mirror and not hate what I see. Please, never stop what you are doing. You are saving lives. You have certainly saved mine. Sincerely, a grateful reader. The men of the Mattachine Society were fighting a similar battle. Their approach was one of deliberate respectability. They believed that if they could just show the world that homosexuals were no different from anyone else, that they were decent, hard-working, patriotic citizens, then the prejudice would fade away. It was a strategy born of desperation and a deep desire for assimilation. Here is an excerpt from a diary of a man who attended one of their earliest orderly protests in the early 1960s, July 4th. We stood outside Independence Hall in Philadelphia today. Our 4th annual reminder. There were perhaps 40 of us. The men were all in suits and ties, the women in modest dresses as per Frank's strict instructions. No displays of affection. No flamboyant behavior. We were to be a picture of quiet, respectable dissent. We carried simple, hand-lettered signs. Homosexuals should be judged as individuals. Equality for all Americans. The tourists stared, of course. Some pointed and laughed. A few shouted ugly words. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back under my suit jacket, and my heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to disappear back into the safety of my anonymous life. It is a terrifying thing to make yourself a target, to stand in the bright, unforgiving sunlight and declare, by your very presence, what you are. But I looked at the faces of the others standing with me, their expressions so grim and determined, and I felt a sense of purpose I have never known. We are not asking for a revolution. We are simply asking for our rights as citizens. We are asking to be left alone. I do not know if our quiet protest changed a single mind today, but it changed me. I walked away from that picket line a little taller, a little less afraid. Then came the end of the decade, 1969, a hot summer night, and the world cracked open. The polite pleas for acceptance were drowned out by the sound of shattering glass and the roar of a riot at a bar called the Stonewall Inn. A new generation with no patience for suits and ties took to the streets. The word was no longer homophile but gay. The goal was no longer assimilation but liberation. The change was sudden, electrifying, and it reverberated across the country. Here is a voice from a leaflet handed out by the newly formed Gay Liberation Front in New York City, just weeks after the uprising. Brothers and sisters, do you feel it? The world has changed. For too long we have been told we are sick by the doctors, immoral by the priests, and criminal by the cops. For too long we have accepted their verdict. We have hidden in the shadows, lived in fear, and prayed for a tolerance they would never grant. But on that night at Stonewall, the drag queens, the street kids, the people with nothing left to lose, they showed us the way. They fought back. They looked the cops in the eye and said, "No more. We are not sick. We are not immoral. And we will no longer be criminals. We are beautiful. We must cast off the straight world's definitions and create our own. We must come out of the closets and into the streets. Our love is not a dirty secret to be hidden. It is a revolutionary act. They call us faggots and dykes. Then we will be faggots and dykes, and we will be proud. We do not want a piece of their rotten, oppressive pie. We want to bake a whole new cake, a rainbow cake. This is a new day. This is the beginning of our liberation. Come out, join us. The revolution is now." This new, fiery energy culminated in the first Pride March, 1 year after the Stonewall Uprising. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen another gay person in the daylight, let alone thousands of them. It was a terrifying, exhilarating experience. Here is a diary entry from a young woman who marched that day in June 1970. "I almost didn't go. I stood on the corner of Christopher Street, my heart pounding so hard I thought I would be sick. I saw the others gathering, the banners being unfurled. Part of me wanted to turn and run, to melt back into the anonymity of my life. But then I saw a woman I knew from the Daughters of Bilitis meetings. She smiled at me, a nervous but brilliant smile, and took my hand. And together, we stepped into the street. The first few blocks were the scariest. People leaned out of their windows, some cheering, many jeering. I felt so exposed, so vulnerable. But as we walked, something began to change. Our numbers grew. People came running from the sidewalks to join us. The chants grew louder, more confident. "Say it loud, gay is proud!" We were a river of people, flowing up 6th Avenue. I looked around at the faces, men, women, black, white, young, old, and for the first time in my life I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself. A people. A tribe. By the time we reached Central Park, I was crying. Not from fear, but from a joy so profound, it felt like it could break my ribs. I was not alone. We were not alone. And I knew in that moment that we were going to change the world. The 1970s became a decade of unprecedented openness and political organizing. A new generation of leaders emerged, like Harvey Milk in San Francisco. He wasn't a cautious homophile, he was a charismatic, unapologetic populist who understood that visibility was the key to power. His speeches were not pleas but demands. They were calls to action, filled with hope. Here is a small piece of one of his most famous speeches, A Voice of Hope from 1978. "My name is Harvey Milk, and I want to recruit you. I want to recruit you for the fight to preserve your democracy. The rights we have had to fight for, every inch of the way. And we can't stop now. We must come out. I cannot stress that enough. Come out to your parents, your relatives, come out to your friends, come out to your neighbors, to your fellow workers, to the people who buy the goods you sell. Once they know you, they can no longer hate you. Once they know you, a gay person, they can no longer vote to take away your rights. We have to give them hope. Hope for a better world, hope for a better tomorrow, hope for a place to go if the pressures at home are too great, hope that all will be all right. Without hope, not only gays, but the blacks, the seniors, the handicapped, the USs will give up. And you have to give them hope. Thank you. But just as the movement was reaching this new peak of hope and visibility, a shadow fell. A mysterious illness began to appear in gay communities in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. It was first called the gay cancer, then GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Finally, it was given a name, AIDS. The joyous energy of the 70s was replaced by the terror and grief of the 80s. The archives from this period are filled with voices of profound loss, but also of incredible love and furious anger. Here is a letter from a man in New York to his sister in Ohio, dated 1985. Dearest Sarah, I'm sorry I haven't written sooner. It's hard to know what to say. Michael is not doing well. The doctors say it's only a matter of weeks now. He's so thin, Sarah. A skeleton. Sometimes when he's sleeping, I look at him, and I can't see the man I've loved for 10 years. The man I danced with all night, the man who made me laugh until I cried. But then he'll open his eyes and he'll smile at me and he's still there. My Michael is still in there. I don't know what we would do without the people from GMHC. A volunteer, a lovely man named Paul, comes every day. He helps me bathe Michael, he cooks, he cleans. He just sits and talks with us. He's a stranger, but he feels like family because he understands. He's lost people too, we all have. Our address book has become a graveyard of crossed out names. Our world has become a series of hospital visits and memorials. The government does nothing. The president won't even say the word. They act as if we deserve this, as if our lives don't matter. There is a rage in me, Sarah, that is so cold and so deep I'm afraid it will burn me up from the inside. But I can't fall apart. I have to be strong for Michael. I hold his hand and I tell him about our future, the house we were going to buy, the garden we were going to plant. I lie to him, and we both know I'm lying, but we pretend together. It's the last kindness I can give him. I love you. Please don't worry about me. I am where I need to be. Your brother, David. From this grief and rage came a new form of activism. Groups like ACT UP emerged with their brilliant confrontational tactics and their unforgettable slogan, Silence, Death. Their voices were not pleas for compassion. They were demands for action, for drugs, for life itself. Here is an excerpt from a speech given at a protest in front of the White House in 1987.
Look at us. We are not victims. We are people with AIDS, and we are fighting for our lives. We are fighting a plague, but we are also fighting a second, more insidious plague, the plague of indifference, the plague of hatred. While we are dying, they are debating. While we are planning funerals, they are cutting funding. Silence equals death. You want us to die quietly? You want us to be respectable victims? We will not. We will be loud. We will be disruptive. We will chain ourselves to your doors and lie down in your streets. We will turn our grief into rage and our rage into action. We are here tonight to tell the world and to tell the man in that house that we are not disposable. Our lives are precious and we will not go away. We will fight and we will live.
Decades passed. The plague years, while never forgotten, began to recede. Treatments were developed. The community began to heal. And the fight for equality moved into a new arena. The fight for the right to marry, the right to have our families recognized. The voices from this struggle are the voices of couples who had been together for decades, who simply wanted the same dignity and protection as anyone else. Here is an excerpt from the personal testimony of a man, Jim Obergefell, whose lawsuit went all the way to the Supreme Court. He is speaking of his late husband, John. John and I started our life together in 1992. We were two young men who had fallen in love. For 21 years we were a couple. We built a home, we surrounded ourselves with family and friends. We were devoted to each other through sickness and in health. When John was diagnosed with ALS, our lives changed forever. As his disease progressed, we had to rely on a team of caregivers. Every day they saw our love, our commitment, our marriage. But the state of Ohio didn't. When John was in his final days, we flew to Maryland on a medical jet to get married. Our wedding was on the tarmac. John couldn't stand, so we said our vows on his gurney. It was the most beautiful moment of my life. John died 3 months later. All he wanted was for our marriage to be recognized on his Ohio death certificate. A final, simple affirmation of our love and our commitment. The state refused. So I sued. I sued for him. I sued for all of us. This fight has never been just about the word marriage. It's about equality. It's about being seen as a full and equal citizen. It's about dignity. It's about love. John was the most amazing man I have ever known, and I am a better person for having loved him. He is the reason I am standing here today, and I will spend the rest of my life honoring him. And so the river of voices carries us to the present day, from the coded, fearful whispers of a century ago to the defiant roar of liberation, to the heartbroken cries of a plague, to the steady, determined voices demanding justice in the highest courts of the land. These voices are our inheritance. They are the threads that make up the beautiful, resilient, and unbreakable tapestry of our history. They are proof that in every generation, in every corner of this country, we have been here. We have loved, we have fought, we have survived, and we have never, ever been silent for long. As our journey through the archives concludes tonight, we're reminded that LGBTQ+ history is not just about the past, it's about the living, breathing words of those who came before us. It's about understanding their fear, their joy, their rage, and their love, and recognizing that we are part of their ongoing story. The person we met tonight, the lonely young man in the park, the brave schoolteacher, the furious activist, the devoted husband, showed us that our voices, whether whispered to a diary or shouted in the streets, have power. The words of Thomas, Jack, Harvey, David, and Jim remind us that the universal human need to love and to be recognized is the engine of our movement. Until our next journey into queer history together, this is the Sleeping Gay, encouraging you to remember that you are part of a beautiful, resilient legacy that stretches back through all of human history. Sweet dreams, beautiful gays, and may your rest be filled with pride in the remarkable tapestry of LGBTQ+ history that connects us all. Thank you for listening. Good night.